Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, September 6th, 2023. All right, first thing, I just want to remind everybody that this is the last show of the week. I have to take the next few days off because we got a new baby coming. We're actually going to the hospital a few hours after I finish recording this. So it's very exciting. If everything goes well, I should be back to record a show Sunday night for Monday. There's a chance I might miss that first day. You know, who knows? Things will be a little chaotic. We also have a 2-year-old running around too. But I'm going to try to get back for at least a show on Monday. But you can still go to antiwar.com for news updates. Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman are going to be writing in the news section, and they're still going to be updating the page for the Viewpoints section. But all right, so let's get into the news for today. The first story at the top of antiwar.com today: NATO countries fear Russia-Ukraine peace talks. That's right, they fear peace talks. So NATO members that border Russia and Belarus are afraid that growing opposition to the proxy war in Ukraine inside the United States will put pressure on the Ukrainians to pursue peace talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And this was reported by The Hill on Tuesday. So we know that the Biden administration's stated policy is to back Ukraine for as long as it takes. They seem very happy to be supporting an open-ended conflict. You know, who cares about the risk of escalation? And the majority of Congress still supports this policy, but there is, a growing opposition within the United States to what is happening in Ukraine, to the U.S. support for the war. There was a recent poll from CNN that found 55% of Americans are against Congress authorizing more aid for Ukraine, more spending on the war. And what's interesting is that poll said out of that 55%, it was divided between Democrats and Republicans, and 71% of the Republicans that they asked said they didn't support more spending on the war. And we also have the front runner for the 2024 presidential election is President Trump for the Republican nomination. He's claiming that he'll end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours when he comes in. Who knows what he's actually going to do, but that is the rhetoric, he's using on the campaign trail. And the Biden administration, to combat this, they're looking to sign a long-term security deal with Ukraine to tie the hands of a future administration on the issue. But the political climate has some NATO members worried that peace might be pursued. And the countries that are worried specifically are Poland and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They've all been very hawkish, throughout the whole war. And this Hill report said that for these 4 countries, talking with Putin is a red line. The 4 nations want the U.S. and the rest of Ukraine's Western backers to prepare for a future where the Russian leader is completely isolated. So the narrative from these countries on what they call NATO's eastern flank is that peace talks would reward Putin. We've also seen that rhetoric coming from the Biden administration. And they say that it would put Russia in a better position to exert its influence. So an unnamed Baltic official told The Hill, quote, "All of this then increases the threat on NATO's borders. Putin would be able to sell negotiations as a victory, and it would help him exert even greater political influence globally," end quote. So Zelensky has maintained demands for peace talks that are really a non-starter for Moscow. The Ukrainians are still demanding a full Russian withdrawal, and they're calling for Russia to cede Crimea before peace talks can even happen. So obviously with those demands, negotiations aren't going to happen. But they're going to, maintain that maximalist position as long as they have backing from the U.S. and NATO. And these Ukrainian officials have acknowledged that without that support, they wouldn't be able to fight this war. So it is U.S. and NATO support, it's primarily the U.S. that's footing the bill here. But that's what's fueling this war. That's what's keeping this war going. And in the early days of the war, Russia and Ukraine were engaged in peace talks that seemed promising, but they were discouraged by the U.S. and its allies. And this story made me think back to a Washington Post report from back then. This was in April 2022, April 5th, around the time peace talks were still viable. And this is kind of how the Washington Post summarized the view of some of these NATO countries. This report said, quote, "For some in NATO, it's better for the Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early or at too high a cost to Kiev and the rest of Europe," end quote. So that's over a year ago, way back in April 2022, and lots of Ukrainians have died since then. And so, we see the talking point from the U.S. is that it's up to Ukraine when they want to negotiate. But according to a report from Ukrainian media at the time, from a newspaper called Ukrainska Pravda, again, this is back in April 2022, when Boris Johnson went over to Kiev, he was prime minister at the time, he told Zelensky that even if Ukraine was ready to sign an agreement with Putin, Kiev's Western backers were not. So that was the message that he delivered. And Russia's main demand during the short-lived negotiations that took place in the first months of the war was Ukrainian neutrality, and they would have pulled out of the territory that they captured. There was other vague things about demilitarization and what they call denazification that weren't exactly clear, but the main thing was neutrality. But now Ukraine stands to lose a lot more because since then Russia has annexed the territory that it controls inside Ukraine. So still, even as this counteroffensive is failing, these NATO countries don't want peace. They want this war to keep going. And, they don't care. It's just the Ukrainians that are dying. And this next story here, this shows what it's like to keep this war going. Ukraine's counteroffensive, a soldier says that 90% of the people there will die. So this is an article from the Times of London. And they speak with some Ukrainian troops that have been fighting on the front lines, and one of them that they speak with is a 23-year-old who says he's ready to die and that he expects 90% of the people he's deployed with to be killed. So that's the reality on the front line. And I'll just read a little bit from this article. "Careless of life, drained of fear, intimate with killing and death, the blank-eyed soldiers of the elite storm units in the vanguard of Ukraine's counteroffensive have a very different battlefield prognosis from that of their generals and political leadership following the breach of Russia's first line of defense at Robotyne." So this is that village where Ukraine said they broke through Russia's first line of defense. I went over that story yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that was saying, okay, so they break the line of defense. Now what? Can they hold the position? And essentially what this is just saying how, they're going to take huge casualties trying to hold these positions and continue to break through or continue to push forward. And this unit of people that they talked to had been reduced by casualties to 25% of its original strength since joining the counteroffensive in July. So they haven't been fighting very long, and they've lost 25% of their people. And that includes, killed and wounded. And again, this guy's saying 90% of us are going to be dead, and that's what they're expecting, and that's that. So it's really horrific what's happening at the front line. Casualties are huge, but in Washington and in Brussels, it doesn't matter. They just don't care. They want to prolong this war to keep hurting Russia as much as they can. All right, so the next one here, cluster bomb deaths in Ukraine are the highest in the world. And this article is from Connor Freeman over at the Libertarian Institute. As the proxy war in Ukraine continues raging, people are being killed and wounded by cluster bombs at a higher rate than anywhere else in the world, including Syria. This is according to a report from the Cluster Munition Coalition. So the coalition, which is a network of non-governmental organizations that support banning the controversial weapons, released an annual report showing 2022 was the deadliest year on record globally for cluster bomb-related killings. Cluster bombs open up in the air and scatter scores of small bomblets and submunitions across large target areas. These often kill non-combatants for decades prior to the conclusion of conflicts where the arms are used. More than 120 countries have signed on to a United Nations convention prohibiting the munitions which kill indiscriminately, but the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia are not signatories. And both Ukraine and Russia have used cluster bombs. This is before the U.S. gave cluster bombs to Ukraine. They were using them last year. Russia is using them as well. And now we know, the U.S. is sending hundreds of thousands of artillery shells that use cluster bombs to Ukraine now. So they're being used a lot more this year. So again, this report just covers 2022, and it's saying over 300 people were killed and 600 were wounded by cluster bombs. And they quote one of these anti-cluster bomb people who say that they were baffled by the fact that the U.S. is sending these weapons because they know it's going to disproportionately kill civilians, but they don't care. So in Syria was recently the site of the most yearly cluster bomb casualties before Ukraine. So in Syria, 15 people were killed and 75 were wounded by cluster bombs. In Iraq, where the U.S. used a ton of cluster bombs during the Gulf War and the 2003 invasion, 15 people were killed and 25 were wounded. In Yemen, where the Saudis have used U.S.-provided cluster bombs to kill civilians, there were 5 deaths. And what's interesting, so this goes to show the lasting effects of cluster bombs. In 2022, there was no cluster bomb attacks reported in either Iraq or Yemen, yet in Iraq, 15 people were killed by them, and 5 were killed in Yemen. So again, it goes to show what these things are going to do. They're going to have a devastating impact on Ukraine for years to come. So you see in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, they're still dealing with cluster bombs that were dropped by the U.S. during the Vietnam War. All right, so the next one here, Australian MPs to lobby for Julian Assange in the United States. So this is some rare good news, I would say. A delegation of Australian lawmakers will visit Washington later this month to lobby for the freedom of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. So 6 members of the Australian Parliament from across the political spectrum will make the trip, including former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. So Joyce said, quote, "We span the hard left to the hard right. Besides the weather and Julian Assange, we probably don't all agree on anything. Both Labour and the coalition think this matter has gone far enough. What is to be gained by going any further? If the Justice Department is seeking a sense of retribution, that's already been achieved by the amount of time Assange has been in jail," end quote. So the delegation will visit Washington on September 20th to the 21st and plans to meet with both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. The idea is to draw attention to the issue before Australia's Prime Minister visits the U.S. at the end of October. So the Australian government has stepped up the pressure on the U.S. in recent months to drop the case against Assange, who has been held without charges in London's Belmarsh prison since 2019, so for over 4 years. And he's been held there as the U.S. has been trying to extradite him. And this issue was raised when Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Australia in July. He rejected the Australian concerns, but a few weeks later, U.S. Ambassador to Australia Caroline Kennedy, who's JFK's daughter, she hinted at a possible plea deal for Assange that could keep him from ending up in an American prison, and Assange's legal team and family are afraid that he'll die in a U.S. prison. So Assange faces charges in the U.S. under the Espionage Act for obtaining classified documents from a source, which is a standard journalistic practice. This criminalizes journalism. That's what this is. Don't let them tell you it's anything else. That's exactly what they're trying to do here. And if Assange is extradited and convicted, it would have grave implications for press freedom inside the United States and, of course, around the world, because the U.S. is trying to extradite Assange from another country. And even a plea deal would set a dangerous precedent, as it would still criminalize the relationship between a journalist and a source. It would involve some sort of conviction. So it's good to see the Australians are really starting to press this. Although, if they really cared, they have some leverage with the U.S., in the AUKUS military deal. The U.S. is really trying to build up its military presence in Australia, and none of that is being affected by what they're doing to Julian Assange. All right, so I want to mention our sponsor for today's show, and that is the Expat Money Summit. So this is coming up on October 2nd to October 6th. If you go to expatmoneysummit.com, you can put in your email for a free ticket. That's right, the summit is completely free, and this is hosted by Mikkel Thorup, who is the head of Expat Money. And the type of things that you learn at this summit, I think are really useful. I think it's a really useful resource. You learn how to be an expat, how to get residencies in other countries, or, not just for a place to live, but also as a backup plan. It's always nice to have, kind of a place to escape to, I think. And that's the type of things that you'll learn at this summit with lots of great speakers, including Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Jim Rogers, Tom Woods. You also will learn about wealth protection and tax planning. And, if you can protect your money from taxes, that's less of a chance that you'll be funding all these wars that are going on all around the world. So go to expatmoneysummit.com. Mikkel is a listener of the show. He's a supporter of antiwar.com. So please go check it out. I think you'll find it very interesting and very helpful. All right, so to get back to the news here, France is holding talks on withdrawing from Niger. So a French source told AFP on Tuesday that France is holding talks with Niger's post-coup government on the withdrawal of certain military elements from the West African country. So France has about 1,500 troops in Niger and has strongly backed threats from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, to intervene in Niger to reinstate Mohamed Bazoum. He was ousted as president in the July 26 coup. France has also refused to withdraw its ambassador from Niger despite demands from the junta, which is led by General Abdurrahman Chiani. So there was a report from AFP. Al Jazeera also reported that French media is reporting there's these talks going on and that discussions of a partial French withdrawal are underway. So this kind of signals that the tensions may be easing between the junta and France, because France seemed to be not wanting to talk with them or engage with them at all. And on Monday, Niger's military-appointed prime minister said that they are hoping to reach a deal with ECOWAS to avoid war. So this is Prime Minister Ali Mohamed Lamine Zain. He said, quote, "We have not stopped contacts with ECOWAS. We are continuing contacts. We have good hopes of reaching an agreement in the coming days," end quote. He also said that they are, still preparing for an intervention, saying that they're ready for an attack. And the junta has outlined a plan for the transition to civilian rule over a 3-year period. And according to Africa News, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, who's the current chair of ECOWAS, and Nigeria really is the big, economic powerhouse there in West Africa. So apparently he proposed a 9-month transition period. And that suggests that some kind of compromise could be made, because until very recently, it seemed like you had ECOWAS demanding that they reinstate Bazoum and the coup saying no. And it seemed like they were at an impasse. But now it looks like, there might be some room for compromise. I know Algeria, which is strongly against ECOWAS intervention, has proposed a 6-month transition period. They're not really involved in these talks, but so it's just good to see that there's still room for negotiation here, because a war and an intervention could turn into a huge disastrous regional war that the U.S. and France would likely be involved in, since they have a military presence in the country. And there's also been reports that the U.S. is willing to, work with the coup government, because they don't want to give up that military presence and that drone base that they have in Niger. All right, so the next one here, Iraqi official says that the U.S. violates terms of agreement. So this is interesting. A senior Iraqi military official speaking to the New Arab said the U.S. had violated the terms of its agreement to maintain a military footprint in Iraq due to the presence of offensive weapons at an American base. So this Iraqi official who was unnamed said that he saw offensive weapons, including Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, during a visit to the Ain al-Assad base in western Iraq. He said, quote, "This is contrary to the agreement concluded in 2021, which allowed the presence of defensive weapons with the advisory task force," end quote. So back in December 2021, the U.S. formally changed its presence in Iraq from a combat role to an advisory role. And really, that didn't really affect things on the ground. The U.S. had 2,500 troops at the time. It still has 2,500 troops. But what they were doing there they were trying to placate, the many elements in Iraq that want the U.S. to leave. There's been a lot of pressure for the U.S. to get out, but the U.S. doesn't want to go. They've been sticking around. But they say, oh, we're just advisors now. We're not performing any combat duties. So this official is saying having weapons like this, it violates that deal, which is just interesting. I haven't seen Iraqi officials say this. And the Iraqi government has been under pressure to expel the U.S. since January 2020, when the U.S. killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike in Baghdad. And that drone strike also killed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who is a Iraqi militia leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is a state-sponsored group of mostly Shia militias that was formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. And so, they wanted to kick the U.S. out. And for years, there was all these rocket attacks on U.S. bases. There's just no need for the U.S. to still be in Iraq, but they just want to keep holding on. And the U.S. says that it's in Iraq to help the government fight ISIS remnants, but the presence also supports the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. The Iraqi military official who spoke with the New Arab said that Baghdad will press the U.S. about the offensive weapons at the Ain al-Assad base, especially considering U.S. activity in neighboring Syria. So as Kyle has been covering at the Libertarian Institute, over the past week, U.S.-backed Kurdish-led SDF, which is the group that the U.S. backs in eastern Syria, and that allows the U.S. to control a sizable portion of Syria's territory. But they've been fighting against local Arab tribes in Deir ez-Zor, which is an eastern province. And these tribes have also been supported by the U.S. They're also backed by the U.S., so fighting among the U.S.-backed fighters. So what was interesting, so this is also according to the New Arab, they said that SDF commander Mazoum Abdi said that the U.S.-led coalition had provided air support in the fight against the Arab tribes. But, I don't know if that claim isn't confirmed. I haven't really seen that anywhere else. I'm going to try to dig into it some more maybe next week, because if that's the case, if the U.S. is, because they say the U.S.-led coalition, but, it's the U.S. that controls that coalition. So if the U.S. did provide air support for the SDF against these Arab tribes that it once supported, I think that would be a big deal. To me, at least, not to, anybody in Washington. But, and I kind of wanted to write up this story about the Iraq situation because, I rarely talk about the fact that the U.S. military presence in Iraq. The U.S. is still there. All right, so the last news story here. Blinken speaks with Netanyahu and Abbas amid a push for Saudi normalization. So on Tuesday, the State Department said Secretary of State Antony Blinken held separate phone calls with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas amid a U.S. push to broker a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So according to the State Department, Blinken and Netanyahu discussed several issues, including Iran and expanding Israel's regional integration. During Blinken's phone call at a discussing Blinken's phone call at a White House briefing, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the calls were not routine, so they sounding like they were significant in some way. But he added that they did not mean there's an imminent breakthrough on the question of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So also on Tuesday, Palestinian Authority officials arrived in Riyadh to discuss the Saudi-Israel normalization talks that are being brokered by the U.S. Abbas is not part of that delegation, but officials close to him are. And PA sources told Haaretz that the delegation is looking to be updated on the status of the normalization negotiations. So Saudi Arabia's long-stated position was that it would not normalize with Israel until Palestinians were granted a state, but it seems like they've softened their stance on that issue. So the Palestinian Authority is looking to the Saudis to get concessions out of Israel for a normalization deal, but the demands do not include statehood. Their big demand that they're probably not going to get, at least from this current Israeli government, is that they want a change in status of Area C in the West Bank, which makes up over 60% of the West Bank. So Area C, the way the arrangement is, I think under the Oslo Accords, is that it's completely controlled by the Israeli military as opposed to Area B, which is partially controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And then I believe Area A is totally controlled by the Palestinian Authority. But they want some control over this Area C. But the issue is that the Netanyahu government, the coalition, includes these settlers, these extremist settlers who want to annex that territory. They want to annex Area C. They want to annex the entire West Bank. So I can't see them agreeing to that. And then for their part, so what would this mean for us if the U.S. brokered a Saudi-Israel normalization deal? Well, the big thing is that the Saudis want some sort of NATO-style security guarantee from the U.S. They might want some military aid from the U.S., even though they got tons of money. They want the U.S. to treat attacks on Saudi Arabia like attacks on the United States. And we do give them a ton of military support and totally enabled their war in Yemen, but the U.S., the military partnership doesn't go as far as a NATO-style security guarantee. So that would be a pretty big deal if that happened, and could really bog us down into another war, in the Middle East. All right, that's it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, The Myth of NATO as a Defensive Alliance. One from Maha Halal, 22 years of drone warfare and no end in sight. One from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies. Is CIA Director William Burns a Biden yes man, a Putin apologist, or a peacemaker? One from Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler and Ariel Gold over at Jacobin. Elliot Abrams has left bloody footprints across the globe. And one from Daniel L. Davis, Why Ukraine's Counteroffensive is Failing. That's over at Responsible Statecraft. But that's everything for me for today. And again, that is everything for the week. I should mention again that it's our fundraiser at antiwar.com. We're trying to finish things off this week. We need some help to make a final push. So if you go to antiwar.com/donate, see the different ways you could support us. Again, this is it for me for the week. I got to get ready for a new baby. So wish me luck. I appreciate everybody that is commenting and helping us with our fundraiser. And I equally appreciate all the people that are sharing the show, and all that stuff really helps. So I'll be back in a few days, and again, I appreciate all the support, but I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.